There is a woman in Minnesota who listens to murder stories while she folds laundry. She has 2 children. She has a garden. She describes herself as empathetic, squeamish, and deeply opposed to violence of any kind. But every Tuesday, when a new episode of her favorite true crime podcast drops, she sits with a glass of wine in someone else's worst day on earth and she says, calm. She is not unusual. She is, statistically, the norm. True crime is one of the most consumed media genres in the world. In the United States alone, true crime podcasts account for nearly a quarter of all podcast listening. Netflix's most watched documentary of all time is about a serial killer. People build communities around solving murders they have no connection to. They create fan art. They cry at the trials of strangers. They argue fiercely about motive. And the question that nobody quite wants to ask is, what does that say about us? Not about the killers. About us, the people who cannot stop listening. Because the answer is stranger and more uncomfortable than you might expect. The easy answer, the one that gets thrown around in think pieces, is that true crime gives people a sense of control. You listen to how someone was murdered. You note the red flags. You tell yourself you would have left earlier, trusted your gut, not gotten in the car. It is a rehearsal, the theory goes, a way of practicing safety from inside a safe place. This idea has a name. Antti Revonsuo, a Finnish neuroscientist, proposed what he called threat simulation theory, the idea that dreaming, and by extension, certain kinds of imaginative engagement, exists as an evolutionary mechanism. In the ancestral environment, your brain needed to rehearse threats without experiencing them. A mind that could simulate a predator attacking camp was a mind better prepared when a predator actually attacked camp. Nightmares were not glitches. They were training. The leap from nightmares to true crime is not as large as it seems. When you listen to how a woman was stalked over 6 months before she was killed, your nervous system is doing something. It is filing. It is building what researchers call a threat library, a catalog of patterns, warning signs, scenarios. The fear is real, but the danger is absent, which makes it, neurologically speaking, almost ideal. But here is where it gets more interesting, because threat simulation only gets you so far. It explains why we might be drawn to stories of danger in general. It does not explain why we are specifically, almost compulsively drawn to murder, to the worst things that humans do to each other. Why not disaster preparedness documentaries? Why not extreme weather content? Why murder, and why narrated in such intimate detail? The answer requires going deeper, into what researchers are now calling morbid curiosity, and into something much older and stranger about the way the human mind handles its own mortality. Colton Scrivener, a researcher at the University of Chicago, who has spent years studying morbid curiosity as a formal psychological trait, has found that it is not, as commonly assumed, a pathology. It is a dimension of normal human personality, one that varies across individuals the same way openness to experience or agreeableness does. And crucially, people who score high on measures of morbid curiosity also tend to score high on empathy. They are not drawn to darkness because they lack feeling. They are drawn to it because they feel more, not less. What Scrivener found is that morbid curiosity functions as an information-seeking drive. The mind treats death, violence, and moral violation as high-priority unknowns, things that carry enormous consequences if misunderstood, and therefore, things that warrant investigation. You are not morbidly curious because something is wrong with you. You are morbidly curious because your brain correctly identifies these subjects as ones where ignorance is costly. This is where history becomes instructive. Public executions were not invented by one culture or one era. They were universal. Ancient Rome, medieval Europe, imperial China, colonial America. Crowds gathered in the thousands. Families brought children. Street vendors sold food. People wept, and people cheered, and people did both. What looks, from the outside, like barbarism was almost certainly something more layered. A collective confrontation with death. A ritual acknowledgement of consequences. a shared processing of something the individual mind could not process alone. The Victorians replaced public execution with something arguably more elaborate: the penny dreadful. Cheap serialized fiction about murderers, thieves, Spring-Heeled Jack, Sweeney Todd. The audience for these stories overlapped significantly with the audience for real crime reporting, which was itself exploding as literacy rates rose and newspapers discovered that nothing sold papers quite like a good murder. The Jack the Ripper case in 1888 generated more column inches than almost any other event of the decade, and the readers were not, primarily, the violent or the depraved. They were clerks and housewives and shopkeepers who had never committed a crime in their lives. The pattern is consistent across centuries. Ordinary people, drawn obsessively to extraordinary violence, with no apparent intent to replicate it, which suggests the consumption itself is doing something, some kind of psychological work. Ernest Becker, in his 1973 book The Denial of Death, which won the Pulitzer Prize and is one of the strangest and most important books of the 20th century, argued that virtually all of human culture is, at root, a response to one unbearable fact: we know we are going to die. Becker called this the terror. Not fear exactly, but a low-level existential dread that the human mind cannot sit with directly, and so buries under layers of meaning-making, achievement, religion, legacy. We build civilizations, he argued, to feel immortal, to feel that we matter enough to outlast our bodies. Becker's successors, Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pischinsky, developed this into terror management theory, one of the most empirically tested frameworks in social psychology. Their research is striking. When you remind people, subliminally, of their own mortality, what the researchers call mortality salience, their behavior changes in measurable, predictable ways. They become more tribal, more hostile to outgroups, more defensive of their worldview, more likely to punish those who violate their moral codes. Here is the link to true crime. Murder is, among other things, a forced confrontation with mortality. Someone's mortality. A specific person with a specific name at a specific moment. True crime does not let you forget that death is real. It insists on it, in granular detail. And according to terror management theory, this should be unbearable, and yet it is not. It is, for most people, curiously manageable, curiously compelling. The reason may be structure. A murder in a podcast has a shape. There are suspects, evidence, a timeline, a resolution. Even when the case is unsolved, the narrative imposes order on something that is, at its core, the most disordering event possible. Death, packaged as a story, becomes something the mind can metabolize. You are confronting mortality without being overwhelmed by it, because the story holds it at a distance that is close enough to matter, but far enough to survive. There is another dimension of this that is worth sitting with, because it complicates the threat simulation theory in a specific way. The majority of true crime consumers are women. Studies consistently put the figure around 60 to 70%. And the crimes most covered, most listened to, most watched, are crimes committed against women. Amanda Vickery, a psychologist at Illinois Wesleyan University, found that women were more likely than men to seek out true crime, specifically when they perceive themselves to be at risk. Not as entertainment exactly, as intelligence. Women who live in a world where certain kinds of violence are directed specifically at them are, statistically, more likely to consume detailed accounts of how that violence unfolds, what the warning signs were, what went wrong, where the failure of intuition or circumstance occurred. This is threat simulation theory, but it points at something the polite version of that theory prefers not to say directly, that for a large portion of the audience, true crime is not entirely hypothetical. The fear it engages is not abstract. These are not stories about exotic dangers. They are stories about a world these listeners already navigate. The true crime obsession does not stay contained to podcasts and documentaries. It bleeds. You can see it in the culture of online communities that form around unresolved cases. Reddit threads with thousands of members, each convinced they have spotted the detail everyone else missed, each emotionally invested in strangers who died before they were born. These communities have, in a handful of cases, actually contributed to solving crimes. They have also, in several well-documented cases, destroyed the reputations of innocent people by identifying the wrong suspect and broadcasting it to millions. The impulse behind the armchair detective is not simply prurience. It is, at its core, a need to impose meaning. A need to believe that violence has a logic that can be uncovered, that justice is a puzzle that can be solved if you look carefully enough. The community around a cold case is, in some ways, a grief ritual for people who have no legitimate claim to grieve, and yet who cannot leave it alone. What is stranger is how the genre has shaped our sense of justice itself. Decades of true crime content have trained audiences to expect forensic certainty, dramatic confessions, and clean resolutions. Real prosecutions are messier. Real evidence is ambiguous. Juries who have consumed enormous amounts of true crime sometimes enter deliberation with expectations the actual case cannot meet. A phenomenon legal scholars have called the EAI effect, though it extends far beyond any one show. The obsession also reveals something about how we think about evil. Specifically, our need for it to be legible. True crime narratives almost always construct the killer as comprehensible in retrospect. The childhood trauma, the escalating behavior, the warning signs that were missed. This is reassuring, because if evil can be explained, it can, in theory, be predicted and prevented. But it is also a story we tell ourselves at some cost to truth, because many killers are not neatly explicable, and because the desire to explain them sometimes tips into something that looks uncomfortably like fascination. What does any of this mean for the person sitting with a podcast on a Tuesday evening? Probably something more specific than they would like to admit. If you are a frequent true crime consumer, you are almost certainly not disturbed in any clinical sense. You are doing something your brain is built to do, seeking information about danger, rehearsing threat, metabolizing mortality through narrative, finding community around shared anxiety. But it is worth asking what you are getting from it, because the answer is usually honest in ways that polite self-description is not. Some people find it genuinely calming, and that is, neurologically, exactly what should happen when the stress response is activated, but no actual threat follows. The resolution feels like relief. Some people find it addictive in a way that concerns them, and that concern is worth listening to. Not because true crime causes harm, but because any stimulus that repeatedly activates the fear response can, over time, recalibrate your baseline. There is also a question about what happens to empathy at scale. One of the consistent findings in research on moral psychology is that humans feel more empathy for specific individuals than for statistics. True crime personalizes death in a way that mass casualty reporting does not, which is partly why it moves people so deeply, and partly why it can produce a strange inverted hierarchy of concern, where the victims of famous cases feel more real than the victims of ongoing structural violence that kills far more people, with far less narrative. There is a philosopher named Thomas Nagel who wrote about what he called the absurd. The gap between the seriousness with which we take our own lives and the cosmic indifference of the universe to our continued existence. His point was not that this gap should fill us with despair. His point was that recognizing it, sitting with it clearly, is itself a kind of intellectual honesty. True crime is, in its own strange way, a popular confrontation with exactly that gap. It is millions of people choosing, voluntarily, to sit with the worst thing that can happen to a person, to really look at it, in detail, with names attached, not to sensationalize it, not entirely, but to remind themselves that the world contains this, and that the thread between existing and not existing is thinner than we are comfortable admitting. The woman in Minnesota folding laundry is not broken. She's doing something old, something human. She's looking into the dark to see if anything is looking back, and finding that the looking itself is survivable, that she can know the worst and continue. That knowledge, even when it is terrible, is preferable to the particular dread of not knowing. The question is not why we are drawn to true crime. The question is what we do with what we find there. Because the dark does not just contain danger. It contains information about what we are, about what we fear, what we value, what kind of world we are trying to make sense of. The obsession is not pathological, but it is a window. And windows, if you are paying attention, show you something about the room you are already in.